work in the place that I do, and good behavior is not something that's rewarded a lot of the time. I unfortunately don't have to look very far for an example that I've been able to follow, and that's the example Gary Hart set for me, and I will be forever grateful for that. And I'm grateful that he invited me here tonight, and that the school of and that the Iliff School is hosting this important discussion. You know, last week I had the chance to go back and be sworn in again to the United States Senate, which is a great privilege. And the day before we had that ceremony, my wife Susan and our 3 daughters were in Washington, D.C., and we all went to the African American History Museum there. I've been there several times before. It is impossible to walk through that museum without feeling the weight of history and without having to confront the injustice that Scott was talking about, of what previous generations of Americans did to their fellow Americans, from Solomon Northrop to Emmett Till. That's why museums matter. But when you leave a museum like that, it can be tempting to imagine that you're also leaving behind the history. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. That history lives with us every day. And you can draw a straight line, as I've said, all across the state of Colorado, over and over again over the last 14 years, in red parts of the state and blue parts of the state, places where people might vote for me and places where people will never vote for me. You can draw a straight line from slavery to Jim Crow to the redlining of our housing and our banking industries, to the mass incarceration today that we have in the United States, to the deep educational inequities that we have, to the disproportionate number of Black Americans who died during the pandemic, or who face eviction in this country, or whose kids can't go to school online because they don't have high-speed internet at home. That isn't history. This is our American reality today. I was born in 1964. I pointed out to my nephew, who had come with us to the African American History Museum the other day, that meant that the year that I was born, less than 100 years after people owned human beings here in the United States of America. And what I was trying to tell him was, that's not ancient history. That's 2 50-year lifetimes connecting the year that I was born to the end of the Civil War. And that was also a year of Dr. Martin Luther King's March on Washington when I was born. And before I was 5 years old, incredibly, America had passed the Voting Rights Act, we passed the Civil Rights Act, we confirmed Thurgood Marshall to the Supreme Court of the United States of America, which then overturned bans on interracial marriage. When I was in college in the late 80s, studying history and protesting apartheid, there was a sense that America was making progress, that we were making steady progress, that we would always make progress, slowly but surely. And when I graduated from college, it would have been inconceivable. I would not have believed it if you told me that 30 years later, America's racial wealth gap would remain virtually unchanged, that it would be the same. If you had told me that our urban public schools would be just as segregated in the year 2023, I wouldn't have believed it. I couldn't have believed it. And I wouldn't have believed that we'd ever elect a president of the United States who began his campaign by calling Mexicans rapists and ended it with the big lie, but it's true. And the value of studying history, in my view, is that you appreciate that America has faced moments like this before, and we have overcome them because of the choices that Americans have made. And that's what I'd like to leave you with tonight. Last October, you might have noticed that President Biden came to Colorado. I was in an election for my re-election, and I have to confess that my campaign wasn't very happy with my inviting the president because his approval numbers were not actually very high. And their view was that it wasn't going to be helpful to my re-election. But I thought it was really important for him to come because the reason he was coming to Colorado was to designate Camp Hale as the first national monument of his administration. The veterans of Camp Hale deserve for the President of the United States to be here. Last year, we also made Camp Amache an official part of the National Park Service on the southeastern plains of Colorado. And what I said on the campaign over and over again this year was, think about those two camps in Colorado, 80 years ago. It's not ancient history. I always say when I come to this part of the talk that there's somebody here who's 80 years old, and they usually say, yeah, it was yesterday that I was graduating from high school. 80 years ago. 80 years ago when my mom was surviving the Holocaust miraculously in Warsaw with her parents who were Jews living in Poland. At Camp Hale, I told the story with the president of the people that had come from all over the country, who had come there to train on skis. Some of them were the best skiers and mountaineers in the world. Some of them had never seen snow before. And they spent 2 years training under conditions that were unimaginable. Because we're in a religious place, I'm not going to say what some veterans remember, or some kids remembered, or kids of veterans said, well, I'll just say it, the coldest son of a bitch in the world is what they said. That's what they said the mountain was that they trained on. But in 2 years, they trained to go to northern Italy, break through the Nazi lines, and they did it. And that was the beginning of the end of World War II. That is a great Colorado story. That is a great American story. But at the same time, at Camp Amache, on the southeastern plains of Colorado, 10,000 people, mostly Japanese American citizens, were locked up behind barbed wire, stripped of their constitutional rights, stripped of their property rights, on the order of politicians in Washington, D.C. It is such a profound reminder that our history has always been a struggle of contrast, as the president said. Always been a struggle between the highest ideals that have ever been written on the page, the words in the Constitution of the United States, and the worst impulses in human history. In our case, human slavery, and the displacement of an entire indigenous culture. And at Camp Amache, locking thousands up behind barbed wire just 80 years ago. And that's the struggle that we are still in today. When a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States writes, as Justice Alito did in Dobbs versus Jackson, that if a right didn't exist in 1868, before women had the right to vote, before black Americans had the right to vote, if a right didn't exist in 1868, it doesn't exist today, we're in that struggle. When we have an education system that instead of liberating kids from their economic circumstances, reinforces the worst income inequality that we have had in a century in this country, we're in the struggle. When people feel like they don't have economic opportunity, they lose confidence that this democracy will actually deliver for them, and that an ambitious politician would show up, as they always do in human history, and say, I alone can fix it. You don't need a democracy. You don't need the rule of law. We're in the struggle. And when our fellow citizens stormed the United States Capitol 2 years ago, under their racist banners and flags and with their anti-Semitic t-shirts, that we're in the struggle. But in the end, it's really up to all of us. Gary's saying, you got to stop, and I will stop. It is up to all. The problem is you picked a topic that I really care about. But it's really up to all of us. The people who trained at Camp Hale could have easily been interning their fellow Americans at Camp Amache. instead of doing what they were doing. They chose not to. They chose America's highest ideals. The people who faced fire hoses and police dogs at poll tests had every reason to give up, to question America's commitment to our highest ideals. There's every single reason why John Lewis, when he was sacrificing his skull on the Edmund Pettus Bridge to those billy clubs, should have doubted whether the democracy stood for him. But they didn't, and he didn't give up. Instead they asked Americans to live up to our highest ideals, from Frederick Douglass to John Lewis to the 100 other names honored on the walls of the African American History Museum that my wife and kids visit. And even many of the people at Camp Amachi, believe it or not, never lost faith in America. People like Marion Kanishi, a senior at Amachi High School, who wrote a valedictorian speech to her fellow classmates from behind barbed wires. And she wrote, sometimes, and this I'm quoting her, sometimes America failed and suffered. Sometimes she made mistakes, but she always admitted them and tried to rectify the injustice that flowed from him. Can we, the graduating class of Amachi Senior High School, still believe that America means freedom, equality, security, and justice? Do I believe this? Do my classmates believe this? Yes, with all our hearts, because in that faith, in that hope, in my future, our future, because in that faith, in that hope is my future, our future, and the world's future. So I want to leave you tonight by saying thank you for caring about our country, thank you for caring about our democracy, and thank you, like Marion, for caring about the world's future. Thank you for having me.